Okay, why don't I go ahead and get started? I have a few topics to cover that'll take a little while, and I want to make sure there's time for questions at the end. Please, as I'm speaking, if you have any questions or comments, use the Q&A function so that we can answer all of the questions at the end. So, jumping into the topic. We're talking about cities, urban environments, and how they can become digitally activated. Over the past few centuries, there's been a mass migration from rural communities to cities. While slowing growth in a few major cities, including Paris and New York, has been attributed to unsustainable housing costs, the growth trend, when viewed globally, really shows no signs of slowing. With roughly 55% of the world's population in cities today, and that number expected to climb to 2/3 by 2050. What we do to innovate cities and to impact the lives of people living in cities is really some of the most impactful work we can do as far as touching the most people's lives possible. There was last month a great op-ed by Norman Foster in The Guardian, in which he pointed out that past catastrophes like pandemics, even while emptying cities temporarily, did not slow this trend to grow the percentage of people living in cities, but instead actually accelerated major changes that were already taking place. We're probably seeing some of this already in relation to COVID, as working from home has driven renewed focus on neighborhoods, on the idea of the 15-minute city, in which everything that a person needs should be within a 15-minute walk from their home. And in experiments that cities are undertaking now with pedestrianization of urban, central urban areas. These are all trends that were already underway. These have been topics for a long time amongst city planners and policymakers, but the pandemic has really pushed them to the forefront and accelerated those changes. So, speaking about the digitization of these physical spaces, smart and responsive, these are words that get thrown around a lot. Smart city has really become, in a lot of ways, a zeitgeist term that's used a lot without context. Responsive is a word that you hear less frequently, but in some ways is more important and impactful to people's lives. The simplest way to understand the smart versus responsive city model is as top-down versus bottom-up, really. So smart city technologies seek to collect massive amounts of data from city sensors that provide basically a nervous system, allowing the city to see, hear, smell, feel, speak, etc. And I'm not using those terms facetiously when I say allowing the city to smell. I mean particulate air sensors that can measure pollution on a moment-by-moment basis in specific localized areas of the city. That can smell or measure particulates to know if there's been a fire or explosion, those kinds of utilities. In the smart city model, all of this data is then collected in a centralized way and used by a city command and control center to manage city resources and city functions and infrastructure. That's basically the image that you see there on the left-hand side in this slide. That picture is, I believe, of a command and control center in Rio de Janeiro. It's interesting. These command and control centers tend to look like something out of, a spy thriller or a dystopian science fiction show, but in fact are entirely real. I've seen them in person, and they're operating in many of the cities that we all inhabit. The responsive city, on the other hand, this concept, these types of technologies put the power in the hands of residents It allows an open data sharing model so that residents can engage with the data, they can interact with city services. The city becomes responsive to the needs of the residents in a conversational way rather than a sort of top-down Big Brother style way. This responsive city vision is also one of automation of city services so that infrastructure can meet real-time needs of city residents through essentially an application layer that lives on top of the data and on top of the infrastructure that will become more and more automated. And the two ideas, they're not mutually exclusive. The data, insights, and intelligence derived from smart city initiatives will serve as building blocks for real-time responsive automation that will come later. This second image, the one on the left-hand side there, is a design by architect Nikitaras Antonis called Variable Volume, which is essentially a responsive building, a responsive public space that uses a cable system to create multiple layers of space that can be manipulated in real time based on the needs of the people in the space and the number of inhabitants and the type of space they need. This has not been built yet, but it was an award-winning design a few years ago. Another really good way to understand the smart versus responsive model is through COVID contact tracing apps that have been in the news a lot recently, especially the way that the UK's approach has compared to those developed by most of the rest of Europe. Primary difference being that of centralization of data. The UK developed an app that would feed all data to a central database, allowing for a important use case, an important function so that epidemiologists can analyze patterns of infection. In most of the rest of Europe, countries took the approach recommended by Google and Apple to decentralize the data so that all contact tracing would be peer-to-peer only with no central visibility by any government organizations. The European approach puts the user at the center. The UK approach puts the government at the center. And this is a smart versus responsive methodology difference. You could argue that some of the lack of success that the UK app has seen is due to a lack of public trust. But when we look at the numbers here in this graph, the countries in the darker blue that have a decentralized model have not done significantly better with adoption rates as compared with those that went for a more centralized model. And it's clear that the public understanding and the public trust levels are more complex than simply if you go decentralized, people will like it better. There are absolutely other factors that impact this as well. France has suspected, and these numbers, just for clarity, are from September. So things have changed since September. Things are constantly changing right now. But one of France's arguments is that all throughout August, most of France was in a holiday mind state, and they believe their numbers for downloads of the contact tracing app have grown significantly in the intervening months. There are cultural differences that would be inherent here as well. So while this is a good way to understand, a good model for understanding smart versus responsive mentalities, the numbers that we see are reflective of a lot more than simply a matter of trusting one versus the other. Another lens through which we can look at this question of public trust is Sidewalk Labs' plans for the Toronto waterfront. Just a disclaimer, I worked for many years for a company called Control Group, which was later acquired by Sidewalk Labs to become a company called Intersection. So I essentially worked under Sidewalk Labs for some years, but everything that I'm talking about here happened after my time with the company and is all public knowledge. But looking at this situation, so Sidewalk Labs, they're a sister company of Google, essentially under the Alphabet umbrella. Basically, Google's sister company focused on smart and responsive cities technologies. In 2017, they announced plans to redevelop the Toronto waterfront as a digitally activated responsive city district. It was a really broad, ambitious vision with ideas like reconfigurable public spaces, automated waste management, user-centric digital control of amenities. There were a lot of public benefits to what they were proposing. They faced a lot of headwinds, not least of all one of a lack of public trust, which is exemplified in a survey performed by Environics Research from the 6th through 11th of February 2019, which found that 71% of respondents, specifically talking about the Toronto project, felt that data should only ever be under public control. But interestingly, that same survey also found that 55% of the public generally supported Sidewalk Labs plans. So there's a conflict in those numbers. The Sidewalk Labs approach did require for Alphabet and Sidewalk Labs to have some level of control and ownership over the data derived from the use of this public space, which clearly people don't want, but people at the same time still supported the plan. And whether this is because people didn't fully understand the plan, because people have mixed feelings about the situation, which is also perfectly reasonable, or because they figured something would change once things got off the ground, that there would be regulations put in place by the government afterward. It's not entirely clear. But what is clear is that there's a desire to regulate these industries. Getting a little bit deeper into this measurement of trust of these industries, beyond this Toronto survey, there's also a 2020, there's a million surveys about this stuff, but another interesting one to point out here is a February 2020 survey by Edelman, which found a couple interesting things. Trust in tech declined from 2012 to 2020 in 19 of 26 markets. In 2012, the tech sector was rated as trustworthy by 77% of respondents, while only 47% of respondents said that they trusted businesses in general. So that's a 30-point gap, 30 percentage points of people trusting technology companies more than business in general. In the years since, in the 8 years since, the gap has narrowed to just 18 percentage points, with trust in tech falling significantly while trust in business in general rose. One outcome of this study, as stated in the Axios article, basically the study found that people favor more regulation of industries and technologies that they distrust. And it's clear that in a lot of ways, the public sector has been slow to figure out how to regulate technology industries. So zooming out from this, we've talked about cities, smart and responsive, and trust, but how did we get here in the first place? What is the historical context in which all of this happens? And to examine that historical precedent, Sidewalk Labs again has really popularized this way of viewing what we're experiencing now through a lens of three major technological revolutions that have happened in cities in the past. The way that Sidewalk describes it is very much what I've got here on this slide, and you can see it in the physical structures of the cities that we live in. The first technological revolution that Sidewalk describes is that of steam engines, which brought people pouring into cities. Paris is a great example of this. The Paris that we know today was largely built during the same time that steam engines started bringing people into the city. It's a very dense city with a lot of people in it, but the height of buildings doesn't typically surpass 6 or 7 stories. The second of these, electricity, gave birth to the 24-hour city. There's a picture of New York there in the center, which has been affectionately referred to as the city that never sleeps. isn't quite true. Having spent most of my adult life in New York, you can't do things like go to a dry cleaner at 4 a.m. in New York. People do sleep, but businesses do close. But the beyond allowing for a 24-hour life cycle in a city, electricity importantly led to vertical growth. As everyone knows, and as you can see from the picture, New York, similarly dense city to Paris, a lot of people in it, but much, much taller buildings because elevators, which are electrically powered, allowed for that to happen. And then automobiles are the third of these. There's a picture of Los Angeles there on the right. And those had a huge impact in the design of cities. In a very planned way, the advent of the automobile and the ubiquitous nature of them led to a very specifically orchestrated displacement of the place people live from the place they work, the place they study, the place they engage in their social activities, the places they shop. And it drove the invention of suburban communities, of rows and rows of living spaces from which you cannot walk to get to the grocery store, your workplace, etc. Interestingly, it's this last one. There were a lot of benefits imagined of this approach, but today many civic planners and thinkers on these topics would love to roll some of the effects of this back with ideas like that of the 15-minute city that I mentioned a few minutes ago. All of this leads then to the fourth urban technological revolution, being that of digital, smart and responsive cities. What that will look like once this plays itself out is not entirely clear. People speculate about all kinds of different changes that we will see in the cities around us. Perhaps cars aren't parked on the street anymore, as autonomous vehicles never need to sit idle. There are many assumptions. That view of the history of urban innovation certainly has merit, but there are, of course, many other lenses through which we can understand the way that technology has facilitated the urbanization of our species. Taking a more detailed view, we can see a multitude of discrete innovations and inventions that together form an ecosystem supporting the lives of people in cities. And these can take many forms. Agriculture, which arguably kicked the whole thing off, led to settled communities. Plumbing and sewage systems have, by some measure, the single biggest impact on human health, with just the ability to send waste away from your living quarters and bring fresh water into it. Refrigeration, of course, has had probably the biggest impact on population growth because of its ability to allow us to displace the agricultural areas where we grow and produce food from the urban centers and transport food from one to the other. The telephone created instantaneous communication. What we're doing now is essentially a iteration of the telephone. And on-demand, getting a little bit more modern with this, on-demand delivery services support local businesses and bring the city to our doorstep. All of these innovations, they can sometimes come in fits and starts. On-demand delivery services, though you can order something now on your phone and have it at your doorstep in a matter of minutes delivered by a stranger, people have been delivering things in one form or another off and on for quite some time. And arguably, the delivery of things like milk in the 50s and 60s died out in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and have sort of returned today. Another example of these fits and starts that's a little more dramatic, the Mesopotamians developed clay sewer pipes around 4000 BCE, yet 5,000 years later, Paris and London were running wastewater in the open down the center of streets. This ecosystem methodology of cobbling together the best of breed technologies from multiple different parties in an iterative way can serve as a solution to one of the key pitfalls of the rate at which we build things, which leads to a risk of obsolescence in the things we build. I should thank my former boss from Intersection, Campbell Hires, for this slide. He came up with this way of understanding this concept, and I think it's a really great way to describe this. There runs a risk in the fast pace of technological innovation and the slow, long pace of building construction, major infrastructure projects, et cetera, of the planning that was done for something like One World Trade building that we're describing here, not taking into account innovations that it can't predict, and not being flexible enough to integrate those new innovations once they occur, which can lead to obsolescence of a brand new building. As this example points out, here in 2003, the architect was selected, which means that the master planning for One World Trade began around then. The first tenant moved in 2015. Between the time that the architect was selected and ground was broken, Facebook was founded and Twitter were founded. These are major changes to the way that we interact with each other and communicate with each other that have taken place just in the short time frame between starting thinking about the building and actually breaking ground on the building. Construction had not even reached street level before the first iPhone was released. 9 iterations of the iPhone, 9 versions would happen then before the first tenant moves in. The number of connected devices will surpass the number of people on Earth before the first tenant moves in for the first time. Square and Nest are founded. The building is halfway done or so by the time a bit more than halfway done by the time that Uber debuts in New York City. All of these innovations mark pretty radical changes to the way that we interact with our city, interact with the world around us and each other, and they need to be considered in the master planning of such a significant and complex building with so many people in it. But without a way to remain iterative and collaborative with these new technologies as they come to bear, that can't happen, and you run this risk of obsolescence. Getting into a bit about my company, at Living Map, we are proponents of this ecosystem methodology, this approach of discrete functions provided by multiple different players. We provide location and mapping technologies that serve as a building block to these types of smart and responsive city projects. Essentially, we build products that are one of the nervous system pieces of these projects. We adhere to this and embrace this ecosystem model in a few ways by developing a specific building block solution for a larger ecosystem. We don't try to be the whole ecosystem, but instead to provide the best possible foundation for it. We future-proof our products through agnostic integration approaches, remain open to partnerships with common data frameworks, and diverging slightly from that, but equally important, we focus on ROI models that have demonstrable value in order to eliminate the reliance on collecting data. And I'll get into that here in the next slide a bit more specifically. Some of our projects are very specifically aimed at providing a service that is specifically targeted to the public good. Not all of our projects, of course. In some cases, we are solving a business challenge for a customer. But in some cases, like this one, the ADAPT project, it really is a public service. This project is aimed at air passengers who require a wheelchair. Research indicates that an air traveler requiring a wheelchair spends at the airport concession only 20 cents on the dollar as compared with other passengers. The majority of air travelers with a wheelchair also report a preference for navigating themselves through the airport, but a lack of confidence in accurate signage for accessible routes. the likelihood that such a passenger who's been put in a somewhat dehumanizing position of having to rely on a porter to push them through the airport when they don't really require that, this person is then unlikely to make a request like stopping to pick up food, because as you'd imagine, I'm sure that would feel even more dehumanizing, to be so reliant on someone that you don't actually need if you just had better guidance. So the tools like the one we've developed here for the ADAPT project can give autonomy and independence back to this passenger, while also lowering costs for the airport and increasing ancillary revenue, by giving that passenger a freedom and a sense of confidence to navigate the airport themselves and stop into the food court or wherever else they might want to go. Defining this need and commercial benefit in advance of the project then eliminates our need to monetize customer data. We can take part in the commercial benefits that we have identified rather than having to monetize that data, which I think is a really important factor, in that too many technology companies rely on the monetization of data as their primary commercial goal. Other similarly public good projects that we are undertaking with our technologies, in some cases building the full stack ourselves, but more frequently as a part of a larger solution. In healthcare, we are working with some partners to identify ways to reduce the roughly 15% of missed appointments due to patients who are unable to find the right room once they arrive at the hospital. Guide staff, where more than half of doctors recently surveyed reported getting lost in NHS trusts on their way to a code blue. And to track costly assets to ensure access to life-saving equipment and reduce unnecessary purchases by trusts. Of course, there are numerous technology companies today providing services that benefit the public good. And I think it's interesting to look at this through the lens of two categories of these types of services that are fairly controversial. Those being on-demand and rideshare services and home sharing platforms. There is clearly, for all of the controversy and the ways that these impact our communities, there is clearly a social benefit to these. On-demand delivery services have been the lifeblood of businesses shuttered during the pandemic, or which would have been shuttered during the pandemic. Ride shares can be leveraged by public transit systems to provide first mile, last mile service to underserved communities at reduced operational costs, which is really important. More far-flung communities that are further from the center of the city, for whom regular bus routes may not be as applicable. Some major public transit agencies throughout the world have experimented with using partnerships with companies like Lyft and Uber to get the passenger from their home to the nearest transit hub, so that empty buses aren't constantly operating at high cost, or the community isn't entirely underserved by public transit. And of course, these underserved communities are often also lower income brackets who need these public transit services more than others. And home sharing platforms can help property owners to diversify revenue while lowering transactional costs of monetizing their properties. And this is also interesting in that it impacts minority homeowners most significantly. Statistics show that minority home and property owners tend to be paying a larger percentage of their income toward the ownership of their properties. So providing a low-cost way for them to monetize their asset can really be impactful in their budgets. Of course, this is why they're controversial, these exact same types of technologies have significant collateral damage. On-demand delivery services, the same ones that are helping helping businesses that are impacted by COVID. They are also benefiting large chains at the expense of independent businesses during the pandemic. And I suspect cities like London and New York will bear the scars of this for many years to come. Ride shares have absolutely worsened issues of traffic and pollution, while destabilizing economic models like fees that airports charge to taxi operators, removing those fees from airport budgets. And of course, minimum driver pay and job security are huge problems, as most of these companies don't even categorize their drivers as employees. There's also the factor, not listed here in relation to ride shares, of the revenue that is siphoned out of public transit systems due to ride shares. The organizations, public transit organizations around the world, see reduced budgets because people are spending their money on the ride shares instead. And then home sharing platforms have definitely damaged residential rental markets. As you can see in this graph here on the slide, Airbnb in Paris was growing for many years. In 2017, the city began to limit, with new legislation, what Airbnb can do in the city. And in 2019, they tightened those limits. But before those limits were imposed, 60 out of every 1,000 residences in Paris had become vacation rentals. And when you take 6% out of the rental market, you do real damage to the city. In essence, private sector businesses cannot be relied on to remain focused on the public good. Arguably, it's not a private sector business's job to remain focused on the public good. It is the job of the public sector to impose a sense of ethics on private sector businesses. That's how we balance our economy and our society. And that brings us to the public sector's role in all of this, which the gatekeeper problem that I describe here isn't necessarily specific only to the public sector, can apply to the same gatekeeper phenomenon in any private organization of as few as a few people. But it's definitely prevalent in these ecosystems that we're describing. Essentially, when needs are not met with existing tools and channels, innovation delivers new and novel solutions. Then efforts to block these new unapproved solutions often fail, while at the same time, a failure to engage with the new solution can be catastrophic. This picture here on the right is protests in 2016 by the Paris taxi union, which turned violent, shut down parts of the city, and Uber is still definitely operating in Paris. Essentially, entrenched systems and public sector bureaucracies can be very resistant to change and too slow to adapt to changing realities. But ultimately, a few high-profile situations aside, this is not a story with an obvious villain. When I say a few high-profile stories aside, situations aside, I'm talking about things like Cambridge Analytica and Facebook during the 2016 elections. There are absolutely good reasons for the public to lose trust in the technology industry. But it's infrequently so black and white as the Cambridge Analytica and 2016 election problem. This is not a story about greedy private sector steamrolling norms any more than it is about entrenched bureaucracy incapable of change. Those two things are both true, and they are both culpable for the problems that we have, but neither of them is the villain or the hero of this story. It's not about big tech or big government or poorly planned public works projects. It's really simultaneously more simple and more complex than any of that. What we're talking about is a problem with the pace of innovation and change that we as a society have not yet figured out how to manage effectively. So, sort of bringing these problems and potential solutions to a defined list here, were the three problems I've identified in this brief talk. First, lack of public trust in both the private sector, big and small alike, and the public sector's responsible handling of personal data. If the public doesn't trust the handling of their data, and their data is required to build some of the benefits that we can see from digitizing our cities, then people won't participate. And if people don't participate, then the whole system falls apart, much like COVID tracing apps. Until you get to 50, 60% of the population downloading the COVID tracing apps, their applicability is very limited. We can't get people to trust unless we, here in the solutions, keep the public informed and at the center of the solution and in control of their data. Keep data decentralized from both government and private sector interests. And very importantly, develop strong, well-informed public policy that keeps innovation focused on the public good and helps to build public trust. Second is the problem of the risk of a high cost for obsolescence. We shouldn't be building things unless those things are going to keep working for decades to come. And like the One World Trade example, there is a mismatch in the pace of innovation that can result in a real risk of obsolescence. Solution, as I would propose it, is to deploy technologies in an iterative and agile way designed to integrate with third parties and innovations that have not yet been conceived. That may sound impossible. How do you plan for that which has not yet been invented? But it's simply a matter of I mean, simply is an overstatement. It's not simple, but it's a matter of building with frameworks and connections that are interoperable between multiple parties, using common database and file types, etc. And lastly, the gatekeeper approach by entrenched interests and public sector bureaucracies that are too slow to adapt to changing realities. We need to maintain close collaboration between the private sector and the public sector partners. They need to be partners. It doesn't work if the private sector feels that they don't have a partner in the public sector and they try to just steamroll and disrupt norms. Disruption has become a word that people celebrate, but there are casualties to disruption. We need to educate public policymakers in matters of innovation to ensure agile legislation and a willingness to engage with private sector innovators. Too often, it is painfully clear that public policymakers don't understand the topics well enough, certainly not all of them, but the people who are making this public policy need to understand the technology. And lastly, and this is the second time this bullet has appeared on this list because its importance can't be overstated, we need to develop strong, well-informed public policy that keeps innovation focused on the public good and helps to build public trust. And I'm going to take questions in a moment, but just before I forget, want to thank our supporters and partners for sponsoring the event, and thank the organizers for putting it on. So happy to, that's all I've got, and I'm happy to take questions if there are any. Okay, looking at the Q&A, as someone who has used disability accessibility services in airports myself, and so have family members for different needs, I find this interesting. Definitely had those problems. I would love to know whether visual impairment has been accounted for and also disabilities that affect ability to navigate, since current assistance seems very focused on mobility needs. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question. We have looked at visual impairment and cognitive impairment and various other types of impairment that needs special types of assistance. Our partners for this Open Inclusion and GRID are really experts. We brought the technology expertise, but our partners really brought the expertise in the way that specific groups need different kinds of interfaces and different kinds of assistance in order to navigate spaces. And while we don't believe that we have solved all of for every case, we tried to solve for as many of them as possible. Any other questions? We'll leave this open for a few more minutes in case there are. A lot of this content, a lot of these slides, you could spend an entire talk just on topics like Sidewalk Labs and the Toronto waterfront, the past urban technological revolutions, the ecosystem of innovation. I'd encourage people also to understand concepts like Songdo in South Korea, initiatives like that. There's a ton of information here that I've really glossed over really fast to give like a broad overview, but there you can get really far into this stuff, and I'd encourage you to do so. Question, have you created interactive maps for towns and cities where the public can interact with and learn about their environment? Yep, that's, oh, and I skipped one. I'll come back to the one I skipped. Yes, we have, and you can see a couple of those. We did one recently. So, of course, as everyone knows, Google and Apple, mostly Google, really own the outdoor mapping of cities right now, but not for every use case and not for every user journey. So a map that we created recently, we've done a few, we've done work with Waltham Forest, with Edmonton in Canada, with Canary Wharf. Recently, we did one for the RUH in Bath, of the city of Bath. I think you can find it on the Bath website. You can, you may be able to find it on the Bath website, but the it was aimed at a specific user journey. You can get to a map of Bath in Google. What that map won't have is detail around the RUH campus and the entry points into the hospital, which were important for key workers during the worst of the pandemic who needed to know, who were coming in from outside the city and needed to find the right entry point. They needed to know how to get from the train station to the hospital and where to enter. And you couldn't do that with Google. So we created a map there specifically for that user journey and specifically curated with only the things that that user journey, user type would be interested in, like where are the chemists, where are the other healthcare assets, where are cycle shops that have made their services open to free to healthcare workers during the pandemic, and we left off things that would not be important to that user group in order to clean the interface and surface only the things they need today. A person in that user journey doesn't care about where a restaurant is because they're all closed. So yes, we have interactive maps of towns and cities for specific use cases and user journeys. Will Hamilton Davies, where are the key areas mobile technology solutions companies participate in the development of smart cities? It's a good question. You know, I think that because it in some ways it depends what you mean by mobile technology solutions companies. My smartphone, for instance, it is a tool for interfacing with all kinds of different utilities. So Apple, as the iPhone, for instance, oh, and there's I think you might have clarified, where are the main areas mobile technology solutions companies can participate? Oh, you just said it again. Got it. Because I skipped you the first time. Sorry. I think that there is, it's interesting. It depends when you're talking about too, because kiosks for, let's talk about kiosks, for instance, for navigating your way around indoor spaces. Well, interactive kiosks were great until the pandemic, and suddenly no one should be touching them. So now we are in the interaction with what we do with mobile technologies, we're instead putting static maps on screens or QR codes on signage, and using the mobile device to scan the QR code to then pull up the map with the route to the destination for which the QR code was created that you've just scanned. But I think that for mobile device technologies, of course, there's the indoor and outdoor tracking of mobile devices that's very important. I didn't get into this during the talk because it's a whole talk in and of itself. The trade-offs we make in regards to data, who should own the data around the tracking of mobile devices, for how long should that data be owned, how can you anonymize the location data and aggregate it in ways that it doesn't point to a specific person. But I think that using your mobile device as almost like an avatar for you in a digital twin kind of world, in order to allow the owners and operators of public spaces to understand how people move through physical space, and in order to allow you to have a personal device with which you can interact with the world around you. It's a broad answer to your question, but I mean, I think there are a lot of answers to it. One way that I think I'll point out a really important, there's a couple more, I guess, conversational technologies. There's a few interesting companies doing conversational work, Location Engine, for instance, who are interacting on a broad range of topics through basic text messaging, so that you don't have to download a mobile app. But also, I think that a mobile device, much like how we all use Google and Apple Wallet, or many of us use Google and Apple Wallet now, a mobile device can be what my former boss used to call your personal preference cloud. All the things that a place or a company might need to know about you can be on your mobile device, but not shared with those other parties in a permanent basis, simply shared in a peer-to-peer temporary kind of exchange until you walk away from that interaction. I think that that's a really interesting way that I, as an individual, can tell the world around me about me, but only the things I want them to know, and only when I'm there present with my mobile device. I mean, I'd be happy to bash back and forth more of these ideas. I think there's a ton there to talk about, but I'm also conscious of time going on. And Will, please, if there's something specific that you're thinking about that I didn't answer, feel free to ask again. Anonymous attendee, public sector authorities are or should be important protectors of the built environment. Do you have any reflections on the current pressure to reduce the effect of planning legislation, particularly in regard to World Heritage status? Mentioned partnerships between private and public sectors. Is the balance right? That's a big one too. Yes, I do have opinions about those things. I think that it does need to be a balance. Whether or not the balance is right, I think is a more or less a local question. I think that, and your question in regard to World Heritage status, I think that in many places the balance has not been right. I'll speak for New York because that's the place I know best. I think that in New York, many of the neighborhoods, due to deregulation of things like rent protections, have been gentrified and changed in ways that don't benefit communities. And this has less to do with technology in some ways than with civic planning. But the same policies that did that were a boon to the New York economy. And I think that in another 10 years, we'll be able to look back with 2020 vision to know whether the sacrifices we made during that time of deregulating certain things was right. I'll speak for Paris. I spent some time in Paris, and I think that the regulations, France, as you'd expect, as many people know, is a very regulation-heavy environment. And I think that the way that France has tried to regulate Airbnb since 2017 has helped a lot, and the balance is right there. And the additional regulations they enacted in 2019 were, I think, the right balance as well. I think that the way that they have tried to engage with Uber has perhaps been less effective, but that's an opinion on my part, and one that I would probably read some more about before standing behind it very strongly. But I think that in general, the bit where you say current pressure to reduce the effects of planning legislation, I think that deregulating things is often problematic. Regulations need to adapt and change, and they need to adapt and change more and more quickly these days because of the pace of innovation. But tossing them out entirely brings us back to the bit I said about how we cannot expect the private sector to remain focused on the public good. That's not their job, and it's the job, I do think that it's the job of the public sector to regulate. Ruth, how do you ensure that those without smartphones or tech skills are excluded? I'm sure you meant aren't excluded in digital city solutions. That's also a really great question. And one that in a lot of countries there is legislation around that. Any capability, any service that you offer to one resident has to be accessible to all residents, in other words. I think that you do that in a few ways. For one thing, publicly available digital screens are a good example of this. Actually, I think maybe a good way to look at this is through the lens of Link NYC, which is a project that my former company undertook back in 2016 to put kiosks on the street that provided gigabit Wi-Fi for free to all residents, non-residents, visitors, to everyone, essentially, and that allowed for a kiosk view, for a kiosk on the side of the device for web browsing and free phone and video calls. The vision there was one of really extending. Articulated. Got it. The vision there was really one of extending capabilities to people who didn't have them. It became problematic when certain people would use the tablet on the side of the kiosk to bring up explicit websites, which then prompted community groups to pressure the city to take away free web browsing. However, before free web browsing was disabled, there was, one specific, maybe you'd call it a straw man, but there was one specific case of a homeless gentleman who had used the tablet on the side of the kiosk to get onto a jobs website and actually booked a job that arguably he would not have been able to book were that not available to him. So I think that you build in inclusivity and access to these solutions, and you make sure. I guess the answer is, how do you make sure people aren't excluded by by making sure that you've provided for all of the functions that you can access through your mobile device, without a mobile device as well, probably through publicly available screens, which of course aren't a popular solution during a pandemic, but are a good solution. But I would also, and I've said this before, I think that at this point in our technological development, we have reached a point where having a smart mobile device is essential for accessing city services. And you look at lower income communities, and you often see households where there isn't actually a computer in the household, but everybody's got a smartphone, and that's how they pay their electric bill, how they book an appointment for the DMV, et cetera. Of course, not everyone has a smartphone, as you're stating in your question. I think that it's probably time to evaluate whether we should experiment with programs to provide smartphones to everybody. A basic Android phone is not very costly. Some data for that phone is not very costly, and I think that just as there are food banks and homeless shelters, there should be programs to give smartphones to people who need them. However, of course, not everyone can use a smartphone. So that solution, that suggestion aside, there are always going to be cases where we need to build in accessibility in other ways. Any other questions? Great. So with about 3 minutes left, I'll go ahead and wrap up unless there's anything else. And thank everybody for joining. And someone asked about making a video of this available afterward. I think that the organizers are looking into that, and we'll figure that out at some point. So thank you all very much, and be sure to attend some of the other talks. There's a lot of interesting stuff to take part in, and have a great day.